Welcome to the first session in the panel breakout room at the Soybean Summit. I hope you're in the right place. My name is Abigail Peterson. I am a Certified Crop Advisor and the Director of Agronomy for the Illinois Soybean Association. Before I introduce today's panel, I'd like to thank the session sponsor, the Soil Water Outcomes Fund. Clayton, do you want to say a few words?
Hey, everybody. My name is Clayton Sessions. I am the Illinois Field Program Representative for the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iowa Soybean Association, and we are committed to connecting financial opportunities to farmers who are implementing new or additional conservation practices to their farms. We specifically work in Scope 3 insetting, working with our partners in Illinois, such as like PepsiCo and Ingredion, companies that are trying to lower their greenhouse gas footprint within their supply chain. So over the past several years, we've been able to enroll over 500,000 acres, covering 13 states. Last year, we had an average payment going to the farmer of $33 an acre. A few things that set us, kind of highlight our program a little bit, is the fact that we have one-year contracts, no long-term commitments on your fields. Those contracts are actually given, an estimate is given to you prior to any kind of signing, so you actually know what you're going to be receiving before any kind of contractual binding. The payments themselves come in two different times, so you'll get 50% shortly after you enroll, and then the other 50% will come at the end of the crop season after field verification. And no acre minimums or maximums, nothing like that. It's designed to scale at each individual farmer's rate. So thank you and enjoy.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Clayton. Clayton will be around for you guys to talk with afterwards if you'd like. So I am not going to read my script because the bios are in the booklet that you have, and I don't want to waste time. I'll just say from the panel this morning, you know, questions were asked about voles, plantability, different things when adjusting to cover crop systems. So I highly encourage you to take advantage of this time with two experts in the field that I've seen a lot and know a lot from the research that they've seen and conducted themselves. So I'm going to start and kick it off to Dan, and then Jim will follow. And then if you have any burning questions during their talk, please ask. But at the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Abigail. Before I get started, there's some acknowledgments I want to do in the room. People that have affected my thinking over the last 12 years on cover crops, nitrogen management, and those kind of things. Lowell Gentry, raise your hand. John Pike. Eric Miller, are you in here? He must have went to another session. But those three guys have changed the thought process in how I view nutrient management and nutrient loss and cover crops. So you're probably wondering, what's a fertilizer guy doing in a cover crop talk? Well, sometimes I'll say that it's penance for all the things that I did wrong since I started in the fertilizer business back in 1973. So I'm one of the 70-year-olds that they were talking about this morning. So when you talk about changing your philosophy, changing what you think, Lowell and I were bumping heads just as far back as 2011 and 2012. I was arguing the fact that nitrogen loss from fall applications was not a big deal. I was arguing that a cover crop only caused additional headaches for the grower and didn't supply the nutrient loss removal that we needed. So once I got involved with these guys and got into the research, all of a sudden I'm going like, I spent 30 years in the retail fertilizer business doing a lot of things wrong. One of my biggest sins, and I'll bring this up, is spreading on frozen, snow-covered soil. And with the help of Lowell, who's got 31 years of tracking the Embrol watershed, the river at Camargo, Illinois, we pulled samples from fields that were spread, and we had runoff in some December, January time frames, and we tracked what was in, because this was in the watershed, we tracked phosphorus loss all the way back down to Camargo. And we had numbers from the field, and we had numbers from the spikes in the river. That will wake you up, and that will make you open your eyes up to nutrient loss. We've got some target dates. So 2025 is coming up pretty quick, right? Could we hit that? field by field, on a field by field basis, just simply put cereal rye after corn ahead of soybeans, and you've got it. The 45% for nitrogen by 2035, if we work together, we can hit that. It's just a matter of getting the correct nitrogen rate, getting the correct timing of nitrogen, and adding a cover crop every other year ahead of soybeans after corn. And I'm going to show you some data from Lowell's recent paper as we get through this. Waterways. What happened to waterways? I mean, you don't see very many of them out there in my area, which is Champaign County. This is from Champaign County. This was a soil loss that ended up in the Embrawl. The farmer across the road, his waterway got silted in, and this is a continuous problem in this field. You could go there today and see the same thing. How they fix that each year, this is a cash rented field, how they fix that each year is go into the field cultivator and level it. That was the same event in the same time frame. That field was spread with fertilizer the first week of March in 2019. We got an inch of rain on frozen ground, and that's where we captured the phosphorus loss that ended up in the Embrawl. So it's real. I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. I can't tell you how many times we were spreading fertilizer the last 2 weeks of December back when I was in the business. And we were spreading on, you have enough trouble trying to even get into the field because of snow drifts, and we were spreading. Do we need to chisel bean stubble? I've heard the excuses. Compaction. A lot of bean stubble got chiseled this past fall. There wasn't any compaction. We had a dry fall, but we're still chisel plowing bean stubble. Just for fun, Eric Miller took that picture of me. I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'm about 6 foot tall, and that's the sunflower ripper that's being used in the fields. I don't know if we really need that. Somebody was talking about the economics of going to strip till. If you want to put a knife in the ground, you can buy a strip till bar and put a knife in the ground and only till 15 inches or 10 inches or whatever, and probably not have much more money in it than what you've got right there. Cereal rye after corn before soybeans. Biomass, 1.1 ton, 26 pounds of N in the biomass. Carbon to nitrogen ratio is 34.1. But that's what a cover crop would look like. You kind of see it, it's kind of yellow. Well, that's because in the research that we do, we try to stay with the MRTN nitrogen rate, and by the time you raise a 250 bushel corn crop, you've depleted the nitrogen, and the cereal rye is barely able to pull any out. So you got 26 pounds of N that's pulled out of that. And that's the size of the cover crop about when we would terminate. You've pulled up the nitrogen that was going down the tile. And we'll show you some tile results from some of his research. Just recently published, split fertilizer nitrogen applications with cereal rye cover crop reduces tile nitrate loads in corn soybean rotation. Lowell just got this published, very good piece. We've sent out some press releases. We're sending out some bullet points on this paper. First year, cereal rye after corn, that's where the cereal rye was. You can see the 40% reduction in tile nitrate loads from that cereal rye. Very good, and that was approximately a 1 ton biomass. Highlights from the replicated drainage tile study in Douglas County. Splitting fall in did not significantly increase corn yields or decrease tile nitrates. So we did 100 pounds of N in the fall. We still had high nitrate losses from the fall application as compared to the other treatments. Tile nitrate loss is greater with the fall applied N versus spring applied. Of the total N loss, about 64% was in the corn, 36% in the soybeans. The spring pre-plant, 75% rate of the MRTN reduced the yield by about 8%, but it didn't really reduce the tile nitrates when you compared a spring split and side dress application in the spring with the full rate of MRTN rate. So the reduced rate reduced our yields, but it didn't really reduce the tile nitrate load when it was compared to the full MRTN. The 75% N rate lost the same amount of tile nitrate as the spring 50-50 N application of the full MRTN rate. And fall lost about 7% of the N rate lost about, or accounted for about 38% of the tile nitrate load. So we're not losing that much, but we're still loading the tile. It's a large part of that nitrate. Went the wrong way. Going the wrong way. So from this same study that's in the paper that Lowell wrote, 1.5 tons of above ground biomass can reduce tile nitrates by 45%. I just showed you we got to have a 45% reduction by 2035. By the way, I'm retiring in 2034 because that's how optimistic I am. CRI ahead of soybeans every other year. Did you hear that? Every other year. In corn soybean rotation, reduce tile nitrates by 33% in the soybean year and approximately 13% in the corn phase. You don't need a cover crop every year. We saw it at Tuscola in an every other year system. So we didn't have cover crops. Actually, the cover crops failed ahead of the corn. So in these strips, it was just the cereal rye ahead of the soybeans doing the heavy lifting. Now, if you're going to go in and rip up the bean stubble after that, you're probably not going to see the same benefits. Moving fall into spring and growing a cereal rye every other year ahead of soybeans can achieve an overall goal of 45%. So taking those findings from that project, we're looking to go into a larger scale watershed, one that's connected with the Embral down there, the Black Slough, which is just outside of Philo, Illinois. The only thing those guys do in that watershed is fall ammonia and till everything up, and there's hardly any cover crops. So it's going to be a learning experience for them, and I've actually got the mayor of Philo that's going to help me work on that project. So that nested, oh, come on. I'm not very good with my left hand. So that nested watershed in the Embral, it's already got monitors already placed, and we're pretty sure from the 31 years of data they have at Camargo that we can affect even the larger part of that watershed, because this is going to be about a 7,000 acre watershed we're going to take a look at and see, and I talk about this in some other talks, we can flip this in 1 year. We can make that change. When you look at that graph of what cereal rye did in that field, we can flip that. Everybody should try this in one of their fields and see if they can make that change. So field by field is how we're probably going to make the nutrient loss reduction goal. Benefits of cover crops: decrease soil erosion, add organic matter, feed microbes, suppress weeds, end catch crop. I'm more worried about the end catch crop. That's what I want to see us do. We don't have to plant green. We don't have to have biomass up to my shoulders. But if we get about 8 to 15 inches of cover crop, we can catch the nitrogen's leaving. Another trial we've got going at Eric Miller's farm is tillage treatments. We're looking at conventional, no-till, strip-till, and strip-till with cover crops. So everybody says I heard this morning that there may be a yield lag with no-till or strip-till versus conventional. This is conventional tillage. That's a 21 corn crop, 22 soybean crop, 23 corn crop. If you look at the no-till, strip-till with cover crops, there is no difference. I don't even have to do the statistics on that and see there's no difference. So it's not a scary thing to make that move. In 21, we had 23.9 pounds of N, 22, 16.4, and 23, 12.2. Depending on how well the cover crop establishes is what signifies how much we're going to get. That's the strips. That's the termination from where the strips were made in the fall. And this is winter barley ahead of corn. We always go winter barley or wheat ahead of corn, and the cereal rye ahead of soybeans. So it only takes about a half ton of biomass, and we saw nitrate reduction. Corn coming up in a strip, not much competition there. This is the line of, this is the 4 treatments, the average of 4 replications of the strip till with cover crop, and you can see how far down it does pull the nitrates out of the tile. So we've got that going on. We've seen it in research. It's there. 1.5 tons of biomass, going to give us about 45% reduction in tile nitrate loss, and that's at a 1.5 ton rate. You can see where the lines intersect. And that's my story. You can give me a call, but our complaints have really dropped here recently, so you may have to keep calling.
All right, so I'm Jim Isermann. I'll be the second panelist for today. As you can see in kind of the bio that I think is provided, some background on myself, working with some of the programs throughout the state of Illinois. My biggest role is working with the PCM program through Illinois corn and Illinois soybean. Within that PCM program, they have what's called the 5-year transition program. It's kind of a subset of the PCM program where we're working with farmers to adopt cover crops and soil health systems. But there's also a research component to that system as well. So in addition to just working with the farmers over a 5-year period, helping them to kind of understand the ins and outs of adopting these practices, there's also some soil sampling that takes place, and there's a comparison involved with that. So farmers are enrolling usually an 80-acre field, and they're splitting it in half, doing 40 acres of cover crops and 40 acres of their standard treatment. Oftentimes we're seeing farmers doing just no-till or strip-till systems and then adding a cover crops, but we do have some trials that are looking at full-out conventional tillage compared to adopting a cover crop and no-till. So a lot of diversity there in that program. I think we had over 60 trials or 60 sites apply cover crops this last fall. Done that for a number of years. Also working some with Illinois Soybean Association and the trial network that they talked about earlier, doing some comparison trials. So what I'm going to talk when I'm talking about what I'm seeing throughout the state, I just want to give you a little bit of that background of where that's coming from, working with these farmers who are doing these comparison trials, working with them enough that we're having those conversations about management. We're understanding what their herbicide programs are, what their tillage programs are, and ultimately what the yield is. We collect that yield evaluation at the end of the year using yield monitor data and making those comparisons to see exactly what kind of an effect is in yield. And then the other key component is the agronomics of that. We talk a lot about the benefits of cover crops and the water quality or soil health, but just the basic reality that we're trying to raise corn and soybean crops as well. And when we're throwing this living plant out there, in addition to the corn and soybeans, there's a lot of agronomic implications to that. So that's a lot of what we try to work with, trying to understand that. So when we get down to the idea if we're losing yield or if we're not losing yield, whatever that answer is, what exactly is going on? What can we do to improve the system, to make it better, and to avoid any potential issues and try to get just the benefits out of cover crops? So looking back on the 2023 year, just to give you some highlights of what I saw, I think first and foremost, the thing that impressed me most was so many farmers starting to learn the system a lot better. Been doing this for a number of years, kind of in the professional space and just talking with farmers. And I think as those of us in the industry are out there, sometimes we feel like things aren't moving very fast or we're not getting anywhere with cover crop adoption or soil health. But for some reason this last year, I just kind of felt like I started to see a lot more movement, at least in the mentality or the knowledge base of farmers, starting to have the conversations, not having to start from scratch with so many of them to talk through how carbon to nitrogen ratios or how nutrient management works, and being able to talk more about some of those advanced concepts. See that as well as with the advisors and the people out there working with the farmers. So I think that's very promising that we're kind of getting past that first hump in that knowledge, and people are starting to really understand more about the system. And I think that kind of started off in the springtime when we started off pretty dry. I mean, we kind of had a standard spring early on. We had good moisture, but then right away we started hearing the reports, especially on the cover crop side of guys, the cover crops taking out the moisture, and then we had some issues with germination with the cover crops afterwards. I was afraid that was going to be a bigger deal than it turned out to be, at least from my perspective. I mean, if that was a problem for you, it was a big deal. There's no way around it. But talking with a lot of farmers, a lot of guys were looking at that system and had terminated earlier, both because they saw the weather reports, both because they were starting to have that concern, also because they're just learning more that those early terminations can be more beneficial because of some of the data coming off from even the work that like Dan has done and others are starting to show that we don't necessarily need 5 or 6 foot tall cereal rye, that 18 to 24 inch tall cereal rye can give us a lot of those benefits. So what I was afraid was going to be a much larger issue wasn't quite as big of an issue just because we saw a lot of farmers doing some of those earlier terminations. In addition, we've seen a lot more differences in terms of the cover crops being used. You know, again, Dan talking about not just cereal rye, using things like barley, wheat, triticale. We've even seen some more brassicas start to come in and be used more often. And I think that's really starting to help us out too. Guys are starting to understand cereal rye ahead of corn is not a great idea. I understand some of you guys may be on some highly erodible ground. Some of you guys are in southern Illinois. It may work out for you a little bit better to use cereal rye in those instances. But generally speaking, you know, cereal rye ahead of corn has been probably one of the biggest headaches and the source of most of the issues that we've had in terms of yield reductions with cover crops. So that message is starting to get through. We're seeing fewer and fewer people taking that on as their first steps with cover crops. So those types of messages, and then even when they are doing that, they're actually using the proper nitrogen management. So guys looking at things such as barley or wheat or triticale ahead of corn, if they have to go to those cereal cover crops, guys also setting up their system in order to not have to rely on those cereal cover crops ahead of corn. Or again, to Dan's point, just not worrying about a cover crop ahead of corn if you're in your early years of the system, right? Just get that cover crop ahead of soybeans, work on that nutrient management, work on conservation tillage ahead of corn, look at strip tilling. So again, seeing those messages come through has been very promising for me. It being a dry year with a lot of the yield data that we've seen come through, and hopefully we'll have some better reports come out on what that looks like, but definitely the mature systems are showing some good promises on the yield side of things. I think we've traditionally talked about a 3 to 5 year transition for soils in order to kind of get over those early concerns about no-till or cover crops and potential yield reductions. As we've seen, they don't always have to be yield reductions. We can, with the right management, we can start to see some positives a lot earlier. That window of 3 to 5 years, from what I'm seeing, maybe needs to be a little bit longer in some instances, but we do definitely kind of get past that phase where we start to see those benefits. And in a year like this year, I think when we look back, we're going to start to see some good benefits as a result of those soil health systems. Not necessarily from cover crops. Some of it is also just from the fact that we're in a no-till system. You know, there's a lot of good benefits from being in those no-till and reduced till systems. So we need to not ignore that aspect and just always jump straight to the cover crops. The no-till is a big component of that. So the different species, I think the applications, this is probably the second fall in a row that I've seen really good aerial applications. I know a lot of farmers have really gotten away from using aerial applications. You know, kind of depends which region you're in or where you're at. But I think that's also a testament to the experience and the knowledge. They're starting to learn when you can use an aerial application and get the benefit. It isn't something that you can necessarily do every year without thinking about it. They're knowing when to pull the trigger on it, when to go after in the right crop stages and everything. And that's opening up that world of other species, right? We want to get beyond just cereal rye. We heard the comment earlier today. When I heard that cereal rye wasn't a great cover crop, at first I was kind of up in arms about it. And then after that, I'm thinking, well, you know, it's not necessarily a great cover crop. It's just a cover crop we can use, right, in our corn and soybean systems. By the time we limit ourselves to when we can get out there, when we can get the crop seeded, the herbicides that we use in our programs that can come back to hurt a lot of the other species, cereal rye just kind of ends up being what we can use. So we're using it quite often simply because it's the cover crop that works. So seeing farmers start to diversify and start looking at those different application methods, aerial application, and then even after harvest, just big differences in increase in getting across acres, guys maybe getting away from the drills quite so much and starting to look at the vertical tillage tools with the broadcasters, even just some guys broadcasting on the soil surface. Again, those things are starting to kind of take off a little bit as we realize, you know, maybe an 80% stand on 10 times as many acres might be worthwhile, right? We talk about the drill being the gold standard, getting out there and you get that perfect stand, and that can be great. You're not going to see that with a broadcast application, but if you get across, you know, 10 times as much ground, maybe we can get a lot more benefit out of that by doing those types of applications. So looking back at the year, I think that was kind of the biggest highlights and what had impressed me the most about the year and kind of gave me the optimism is just seeing the way farmers are adopting. And that's, I see some of you in the room that have been doing this for so long. Some of you guys have been the leaders on this, and you've been the ones that have been developing these different ways of doing that. But I'm just starting to be able to see it on more acres being implemented at a larger level. So cover crops aren't something, they're not going to happen overnight, and they shouldn't. Going back, we look at our goals and what the industry, what the environment wants out of us. Cover crops are not something that should occur overnight. It's going to take a long time to develop the knowledge base, to develop the advisors, to develop the farmers to take on these systems. And so I do see us making progress. I think that's kind of my biggest look at this last year. So.
Great job. Opening up the floor for questions.
Dan, have you seen the tiles take longer to start running as your cover crops have been in there longer and longer? Like you're building up soil structure, and that as it rains, the soil can hold more of that water before it runs out the tile? Are you seeing any of that, like reduced flows from rains?
In the long-term field there at Eric Miller's, he's able to go in and no-till, and in a dry year, we find that we don't see the stress on the corn. Now, whether or not the time from rain, once we're saturated, we go through the tile pretty quick. But with that structure that he's built over the last 10 years, we see the crop able to survive through the drier weather a lot longer. We see a lot less stress on the crop because it is a sponge, because it's holding a lot more moisture within there. And I think that's probably what I've seen more than anything. Lowell?
We didn't see any difference in top flow with cover. No less, no.
As the system is there longer, and you're building up that soil structure.
Thanks. Yes, but at this point, we hadn't seen it. No, we get so saturated in the spring that the same amount of tile flow happened across all of our treatments. So it was no. Now, winter wheat shuts the tile off a couple of months earlier than corn and soybean. That's an interesting fact, because it's bolting when corn and soybeans just being put in the ground.
Now, you might see that. That brings up a good point, Lowell. That you might see that when you let your CRI go to head and you're starting to try to fill grain. We don't go that far. We try to we're looking at nitrate loss, and in the process, we don't go to that headed out CRI and planting green.
How are we doing in terms of 2035 for the 45% in loss? How's that coming along?
We can do it, but it's going to take implementation. It's going to take some change, and I think I fought change. It had to be slapped upside the head with the research that we've been doing for me to understand that this can work. And I was setting, I'm 70 years old. I was setting my ways, and when I started working with Lowell and John Pike and Eric Miller and saw what we were able to do, that's when I got enthused about this and said, well, we can do this across all the lands. We have the systems. We know what the system is to reach 45%. It's just going to take some changes, and we got to be willing to make those changes. A cover crop ahead of soybeans every other year and targeting your nitrogen applications, it's a timing thing, and also it's a rate thing. So let's get down to the MRTN rate. The MRTN rate, I worked with Dr. Knopfsinger for many years. We were around the state and we put in these N-rate trials. We know that nitrogen rate is correct, and that's where you need to be. You need to be somewhere below 200 pounds. Well, in the survey that IFCA is doing, I'm finding that we are at about 180, 190 pounds of N with the applied nitrogen. But what Lowell said was the incidental nitrogen, which is the MAP, DAP, MES10, all those other products, they're not being counted. So once we count them in this survey, because we're counting every pound of nitrogen, we're at 220, 210, 215. So we found out at Tuscola that if we zero in on that about 180, that crop is not nitrogen starved, but it's not leaving a lot out there for the cereal rye to pick up. I guarantee you, and I've seen N-rate trials where we followed up with cereal rye after an N-rate trial, so that's a 0, 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. I can find the randomized outline of the 250, the 200, and sometimes the 150. You see that. Eric Miller does a stalk nitrate test. He's got 2 N-rate trials for us. He's got one in the 3-crop rotation, which is all no-till and strip-till and wheat, and he's got one in the field that's tilled. We got a tillage trial. They're totally different, but he's doing an N-rate. He's doing stalk nitrate, and once you get to that above 200 pounds, the stalk nitrate is higher, and it's every year. And we got documentation, 8 years, Lowell, something like that.
You talk about that 1.5 ton, I'm over here. You talk about the 1.5 ton of biomass. How tall is that and how thick is that planted?
So we're running about 60 pounds of seed per acre and probably around knee high, something like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, and that's probably one of the biggest keys is to visualize that, because that makes it achievable. 1.5 tons. You're a cattle guy, you probably have an idea of what that looks like, but you get away from a livestock guy, they have no idea what 1.5 tons looks like. So yeah, I think quantifying that has been a huge deal to start making it achievable. So.
All right, Jim, I'm going to have you take the clicker and click to the next slide. I set up a little fun surprise slide deck to kind of give a visual and let Dan and Jim kind of just do rapid fire of, what are their comments. So this is actually of Jay's field, and you've all heard him talk about using the strip till in cover crops. What are your recommendations when using strip till in cover crops? Does it have to be up? Can it be at the same time? Also, are you seeing different kind of applications that can bring this more precision to cover crop plantings?
How many tons do you think that is? Do you have an idea how many that would be? About your half ton, probably? Maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe a little more than a half ton. So again, just to quantify the tonnage, you really don't have to get that big to get that half ton, 3/4 of a ton. So strip tillage, I think absolutely with cover crops has been huge. I think it's something that you guys have done largely since the beginning, and I think one of the reasons why you haven't had some of the issues others have had in terms of yield losses, especially with corn. I think this is really, really important when we talk about planting corn into a cereal cover crop like this. Strip tillage is going to be huge. We're seeing a big interest again in strip tilling ahead of soybeans, obviously because of earlier planting, which when we talk about earlier planting of soybeans, it has really put quite a monkey wrench into the expectation of a cover crop. If we go back 10 to 15 years ago, when cover crops were first coming out, we were planting our soybeans in the middle of May. We almost always saw a nice positive when we were planting soybeans into our cover crop fields, because when we were doing it, it was warm, it was dry. That cover crop was pretty well kind of all upside when it came to that. Now the guys are wanting to plant a lot sooner in the year. They're out there in early April, mid-April. We start to kind of have to manage that cover crop a little bit differently. So even guys who were saying, 10 years ago I tried strip tilling soybeans and I didn't really see a positive out of it. Now that they're planting earlier, they're starting to play around with that again and wanting to go back out there and try that strip tilling. And even also the planting green aspect, as we move earlier and earlier with our planting, I like to terminate around that boot stage or a little bit earlier, cereal rye. So that used to be something that you could do. You could go out, you could terminate, you can maybe wait 10 days to 2 weeks to come out and do your actual planting, which I think from an agronomic perspective is actually still pretty good, except for the planting date. We're in a scenario now where people want to plant earlier, so that makes that planting green in order to time that with the termination much more important. And then the strip tillage, especially as we talk about nutrient management, becomes very important, especially on the corn side of things. So there's a lot to that. I think we see a lot more, partially because cover crops are so tied with no-till that sometimes we don't kind of allow the conversation to go to strip till, but it is definitely something that's been a key part of it.
One of the things that comes to mind when looking at that, so Eric will plant cover crops with a 15-inch row planter, and then when he comes back in and plants his soybeans, he goes between those rows of cover crop. that helps. With the strip till, one of the things that I wish I'd brought that, had that picture up from this past spring. We were doing some strip tills, soybeans in 30-inch rows, and we added fertility in the fall. So we had some MESZ or MAP or DAP or something in the row. And then we had the 15-inch rows and some of the 30-inch rows that were not fertilized. Well, the cereal rye, by the time we got around to planting it, was probably 8 inches taller where we had the fertilizer, even in the band. The cereal rye had gone into that furrow and picked up that nitrogen, so we didn't lose any nitrogen. And then, like Lowell would say, if you terminate early enough, you'll bring that nitrogen's in that plant back out of that plant earlier, rather than letting it go to a stalk or whatever. The leaf will break down quicker. One of the things I like, and John Pike's been working on this for several years, is precision planting of cover crops, where he leaves a strip open in there when he's planting it. So you're using RTK, you plant your cereal rye, but you leave that strip open. If you're in a no-till system, it's almost as good as if you've been in a no-till system for a while, you don't really need to go to strip till. You can transition to no-till, and that way you've got your cover crop is leaving a gap for you to plant into. It's bare ground, and you've gotten the weed control out of it too, same time. But that's something that follow John. He talks about that quite a bit.
Seeing the cereal rye there makes me think also about termination. I've heard more about, maybe not with cereal rye, but more maybe an annual rye or something like that, trying to terminate without the residuals. Well, any thoughts along that, whether you can put your residual products in with the termination?
So last year was one year where, for some reason, a lot of people saw that the residual in with the burn down allowed some of the cereal rye to survive, and we had an issue last year. It wasn't severe, but the cereal rye didn't die. So I have never applied a residual with my burn down. I always want to do a burn down separately, and that's, I don't know if that comes from the old chemical guy or not, but that was always something. I didn't want to antagonize that Roundup from killing the plant and killing it completely.
Yeah, so obviously, first of all, when you're talking about annual ryegrass, it's extremely important. That one's kind of in a world on its own. But when we look at these, cereal rye, barley, with the growers, that I work with through these different programs, there's usually not significant issues, but every once in a while something comes up, similar to what you said. It's not like it didn't kill it at all, but for some reason maybe it didn't get a complete kill, and we can usually trace it back to using some of the known troublemakers with your mixed in with your glyphosate. So it isn't all residuals. There are specific ones we watch out for, and they're notably the triazines. So your atrazine on the corn side, on the soybean side, the one that probably causes the most problem is metribuzin, which is your Sancor products, which are in a lot of tank mixes. Very few people are actually applying Sancor, but it gets into a lot of these tank mixes. And when we go back and if somebody had a problem, they almost always are using those. So is it enough to warrant taking it out of your mix? Maybe not necessarily, at least early on. Just be aware that it could cause a problem, and I think most guys who go down the road of using cover crops every year are going to find a way to put that in a different pass. They're just going out there with just the glyphosate, so that they're not having any issues with the termination. Callisto is another one that sometimes causes problems. Isn't in burn downs too often, but sometimes somebody's using it. So it is a concern, and if you're doing annual ryegrass, you absolutely need to follow all the rules. Purdue actually has a really good guide if you go under their extension service about how to tank mix, how to do everything right. Anybody who's got annual ryegrass should follow that to the T. If you're doing these cereals, the problem is less common, but it is something that comes up. But it's only a certain percentage of the time. That's the struggle. You're not always going to have a problem. So lots of guys do it. Oh, I do this every year. I never have a problem. And then, 1 out of 10 years or whatever it is, the problem comes up. Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is in regards to the pH and the conditioning of the water. Again, I'm not necessarily a chemical guy. That is obviously one of the steps a lot of people take. getting that correct. I'm not sure how. I know some guys do go a little more extreme on how low they want to get that. So again, following the right label rates and following this Purdue Extension guide. That's why I hand it out to people, because it lists all that information, like what you should have in terms of tank mixing and properly conditioning the water. But pH, yeah, the right water is extremely important. You got to pay attention to what your water is when you're putting it in.
Do you want to click the next slide?
I don't know. Do I want to click the next slide?
I did not prep them, and so this was actually a great. That was an annual ryegrass field, Jim. Do you just want to touch base just quickly on what happened?
Don't use gramoxone to terminate annual ryegrass. Yeah, I know gramoxone has become a little more popular, especially to the south, because of weed-resistant issues, but it is definitely, you will get some kill, and if you don't get a good termination, the first shot with annual ryegrass using gramoxone could be important, but we need to make sure that these contact killers on something like an annual ryegrass aren't going to work very well. You just have a very large root structure underneath something like annual ryegrass, and using something like a contact killer isn't going to work very good. If you're against glyphosate, you're probably not going to want to have annual ryegrass in your system, just because you're really going to need something like that. You can use clethodim, something like that, if you need to, if you're really against using glyphosate, but oftentimes you're going to see more than one application needed to get a really good kill. So the other moral of the story is not to use annual ryegrass if you're in a non-GMO system. And in fact, even any of the cereals, if you're using non-GMO corn, you got to be really careful that you're getting a good kill early on and not having to come in with the rescue treatment.
We found for terminating annual rye, a winter vortex is probably one of the best systems. That was in one we tried. So we on the corn side, we tried trying to get oats and radish established for a couple of years, never did get it. So we said, oh, we'll go to annual rye. Went to annual rye, and we had a winter vortex, wiped it out, and so then we ended up going. Started going with winter wheat. But anyway, yeah, we haven't messed with annual rye all that much on any of our trials, except the one time that it did fail.
Okay, I want to do one more slide. We have like a minute left. So this is 2019. Obviously, that was the year of wet planting. Do you guys want to touch base on maybe the top mistakes you saw from 2019 and what we learned from it?
So we were at Tuscola, and that's a Milford soil. It used to be an old seabed, right, Lowell? Lake bed. And that was most of the year that year. I think we planted the corn and beans about June 1st that year. It was horrible down there. We had enough flooding where in the fall that we lost some of our cereal rye stand where the cereal rye made it. It planted fine, so we didn't have any problems. I guess I'm not sure what the question really was about it, but I don't want to repeat 2019 again.
Yeah, so where you couldn't get in early, I think that was kind of the biggest concerns about 2019. And granted, a lot of farmers did hear the message about planting green and about not wanting to terminate your rye and then end up with saturated conditions. So I mean, hats off to the farmers at that time. They understood that message. They were very wary about going out and terminating early because they didn't want to continue getting the rains and then face that issue where they were going to have those wet, saturated soils. But unfortunately, 2019, it just kept raining. So you ended up with a lot of very tall rye, a lot of situations that had they terminated earlier, by the time we were able to get into the field, the rye would have been deteriorated. But I think the two things that stick out in my mind from 2019, looking at a picture like this, is the idea of just because you can doesn't mean that you should. We hear a lot of situations where people give a testament to their soil health and cover crops about being able to get out on a field early, which is absolutely true and oftentimes is very warranted. But we do see situations where just because it'll float your tractor across the field because you've got that soil health or that rye, you really have to think about the damage that you're doing to that soil long term, because once you do something like that, it's extremely difficult to get that kind of compaction out of a soil without some sort of tillage. And then the last thing I would say is in terms of the canopy that rye caused, working with growers in the 2019 year, we had some guys that went out with just rollers, not roller crimpers, but they still did a chemical termination, and they went out with a roller and just knocked that rye down. And we saw significant improvements in yield in that situation compared to just
Try the next slide.
compared to just planting.
Keep going. Keep going. There you go.
Compared to just planting into that canopy with the rye. So this one is just actual wheel tracks, but you can see the difference on the right-hand side in the nodes, how elongated they were, just looking at where the wheel track was, where it knocked down the rye versus where it let that rye stand. But we had guys doing whole fields this way, taking out those land rollers, those 60-foot wide land rollers, and just knocking that rye down when it was that tall. Otherwise, that rye is still standing in August and in September and can even be there at harvest. So if you ever get to that point where we see that rye still standing or really doing that heavy canopy, doing something to get it knocked over, that's what's going to happen once we get to that higher carbon to nitrogen ratio a little bit higher in the year. So I think that was one of the other big learning points from 2019 is how impactful knocking that rye canopy down could be.
I do remember now in 2019, that was the year we bought a Gator with a auto steer and a 200-gallon sprayer with a 60-foot boom. So with our research stuff, we do have the ability to get through some of those muddy conditions. This brings up a good point. So we, down at Douglas County, we did a crimping and no crimping trial where we harvested, and we didn't find any difference in the yield between the two. What we did find out was if we didn't have that cereal rye on the ground, when we harvested and it got a little bit damp towards the evening, it drug up on our soybean, our bean head. So that was one of the things, trying to get that residue probably helps having it laying flat on the ground when it comes to harvestability.
Thank you both. And for me, this is cut way too short. We're at the end of our time. Obviously, Jim and Dan have a wealth of knowledge. You have their contact information. The agronomy team at ISA are extremely excited to be working with both Jim and Dan on projects moving forward and what we do together. I hope you see value from just even this small snippet of information. I do want to touch bases. Dan did mention the nutrient loss reduction strategy, and the efforts towards those reductions need to be taken very seriously. And in your own operations, I'm glad Dan covered that. Jim, as well as taking what we have seen as far as in other people's fields, but being able to apply it to multiple scenarios and see across the board that we can see impacts to these agronomic tools is something that's greatly needed as far as guidelines in the state and what we can actually use as recommendations. So I know a lot of people in the room might be at different stages of adoption of cover crops and you know where you're at in the transition, or if it's something you want to approach or something that you're ready for the next step of something new and advanced. So really what I'm going to do, my wrap-up question for Dan and Jim is, going into this next growing season, what are you excited to see for cover crops, and what's something or that you'd want to study? Well, Dan, you've got your great studies going on, but what is something that you want to see this next year with cover crops and see what they can do?
I guess on our own farm and then other farms, just really looking at the strip tilling with soybeans. I think that's what, you know, we've stayed away from that with planting solid stands of cereal rye, but this year we might be looking into planting 30-inch row beans, at least on some fields, and applying a strip with a spring strip freshener just to kind of go after the earlier planting soybeans. So I definitely see that as kind of necessary in order to get after that earlier planting.
For those that have planted a cover crop this past year, we've had a rather warm November, December, and now going into February it's warm. We're going to get a lot of growth out of the cover crop. I'm kind of excited to see what the tile nitrates look like. I think we're going to have a pretty good reduction, and with the growth of the cover crop, we're going to see the benefits from that nitrogen reduction. The year before, not so much, but I think this year in the tillage trial we have at Eric Miller's, we're going to see that because we got good growth from the covers.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause.